It takes a lot of effort to bring you these stories, and I'd really appreciate your support. All I ask from you is a like and subscribe. Thank you. I still can't wrap my head around it. I mean, the world. Used to be full of people, talking, laughing, fighting over stupid things like who parked too close at Walmart, or which barbecue joint had the best brisket. People losing their minds over some teenager playing their music too loud at the gas pump, moms screaming at each other in the grocery store over the last can of pumpkin puree come Thanksgiving. Now it's just empty. It feels wrong, like someone pressed pause on life and forgot to hit play again. I sit here talking into this busted radio, wondering why I even bother. Don't even know if anyone's listening. And if they are, what am I supposed to say? That it gets better? That help's coming? Hell, I can't even tell myself that lie anymore. I reckon I should be dead by now. A lot of folks are. Good folks. Better folks than me. Sometimes I wonder if it'd be easier to just let go. But I can't. Ain't sure if it's stubbornness or stupidity, but I keep waking up. Keep breathing. Ain't no more laws, no more cities, no more Sunday church or Little League games or birthday cakes. All gone. I don't even know what day it is anymore. Feels like time stopped when the world did. But I remember how it started, how everything fell apart piece by piece. Guess if anyone's out there, maybe you should know too. Maybe it helps to hear how it all went to hell. Name's Mr. J, by the way. Reckon if I'm gonna tell my story, might as well have a name to hang it on. I keep thinking about my life before all this, like it's some kind of story someone else lived. But it was mine. And it was good. Simple in a way folks nowadays might not understand. I work a ranch out past Abilene. Family-owned place belonged to my granddaddy, passed down to my old man, then to me. Acres of dry Texas land with stretches of brittle grass and patches of mesquite trees. Dust kicks up in thick clouds whenever the wind blows, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. We have cattle, tough and lean, the kind that know how to survive out here. A few goats, two ordinary little things that never stay where they're supposed to, always squeezing through gaps in the fence like it's a game. Mornings start at 4:30 sharp. Feeding the animals, checking the fences, fixing whatever broke the day before. The work never really ends, just rolls over into the next day. The house is a 2-story place my granddaddy built himself, wood creaking with every step, but solid as stone. There's a tool shed out back, a barn with rusted hinges, and a watchtower we built after things went bad gives me a view of the whole property. The ranch is our world, me and my wife. A quiet, steady life, even after the world fell apart. And I hold on to it with everything I have. But of course, it's not the same as before. Before, we had people and a real community. Weekends were my favorite. We'd throw these big barbecues, invited damn near everyone we knew. Spent the whole day smoking brisket, drinking beer, laughing with friends. We had a big old oak tree in the yard, and the kids would hang a rope swing from one of the branches. They'd be out there for hours, screaming and laughing like wild animals. My buddy Carl always brought his guitar, played old country songs, Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard. Sometimes we'd all sing along, even though most of us couldn't carry a tune to save our lives. Didn't matter. It was about being together. On Friday nights, we went to the high school football games. Whole town showed up, stands packed, people cheering so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. Didn't matter if the team was any good, folks just wanted to be there. Seeing the kids play their hearts out under them stadium lights, smelling popcorn and hot dogs, hearing the band play that same damn fight song over and over. After the game, we'd all head to the local diner, a place called Ruby's, ate burgers and fries, talked about the game like it was the NFL playoffs. Ruby herself worked the grill. She was this tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she ran that place like a drill sergeant. Called everybody hun and smacked you with a spatula if you got too rowdy. I can't believe how much I miss it. The normal stuff. The stuff you don't even think about when you're living it. Just sitting around a table with friends, having a reason to laugh. I don't even know why I'm talking about this. Ain't like it matters now, but maybe it does. Maybe someone out there's listening, and maybe they remember too. Anyway, I just don't want to forget. You know, I keep trying to figure out when exactly it all started, when the world went sideways. Guess folks like to point to different moments, different places. But for me, it started in Miami. I was sitting in my truck, eating a gas station sandwich, listening to the radio. Had the news on, not because I cared much about politics or whatever, because I liked the way it filled the silence. That's when I heard about it, that Miami zombie attack. Of course, they didn't call it that at first, just said some guy was attacking people near a causeway. Said he was naked, ripping another man's face off with his teeth. I laughed. I ain't gonna lie. Thought it was some kind of substance misuse. People do crazy stuff all the time. But then the story kept getting worse. They shot the guy, and he didn't stop. Just kept biting and tearing until they put 5 more bullets in him. That part stuck with me. 5 bullets. I remember going home that night and telling my wife about it. She was watching one of them true crime shows, half listening while I went on about how people were losing their damn minds. I even made a joke, said maybe the apocalypse was starting. She told me to quit talking nonsense and pass her the remote. But it ain't funny now, is it? Thing is, that Miami story stuck in my head. Kept checking the news trying to figure out what happened. They blamed bath salts, said the guy was under the influence. But then more stories popped up, same kind of thing. Random attacks, people biting each other in parking lots, in grocery stores. Cops putting folks down with way more bullets than should have been necessary. But there was more. Small-town Facebook groups started lighting up like Christmas. At first, it was just harmless gossip folks complaining about kids knocking over mailboxes or someone's dog tearing through a neighbor's chicken coop. Normal stuff. But then the posts got darker. Real dark. A woman near Sweetwater uploaded pictures of bloody handprints smeared across her back door. Fingers splayed wide, like someone had clawed at the wood trying to get in. Said she heard scratching late at night. Thought it was a raccoon until she saw the prints the next morning. Her husband wanted to call the cops, but she just scrubbed the door clean and posted in the group, asking if anyone else had seen anything strange. Turns out they had. An old rancher claimed he woke up to the sound of something banging against his barn. Figured it was a cow that wandered loose. But when he went out with a shotgun and a flashlight, he swore he saw a man standing in the shadows barefoot, clothes torn to shreds. The rancher called out, told him to get off his property. Said the man didn't move, just stood there, head cocked to the side like he was listening. Then he bolted. running on all fours like an animal, disappearing into the brush. People in the comments were freaking out, but most folks laughed it off. Said the old man was probably just seeing things. Maybe it was a coyote or some tweaker under the influence. But the stories kept coming. A teenage girl posted about her dad, a hunter who went out one morning and never came back. The sheriff's department searched the woods for days, found nothing but his rifle snapped clean in half like a twig. The girl swore up and down that her mom heard knocking at the front door 2 nights later. When they checked the porch, there was a trail of bloody footprints leading up to the door and back into the trees. And then there was the woman with the cows. She lived out near Nolan County. Said her husband went out to check on the cattle after hearing a bunch of noise, said he'd be back in 10 minutes. When he didn't come back, she grabbed a flashlight and went looking for him. Found his boot near the fence line. Said it was still warm. The cops searched for 3 days and never found a body. People whispered about mountain lions, but she swore she saw someone standing at the edge of the property that evening. Said the figure just watched her, staying perfectly still until the sun dipped below the horizon. And then it was gone. The posts kept piling up, folks uploading grainy videos from porch cameras showing figures moving through fields, bodies jerking and shuffling like their bones didn't fit right. The videos never lasted long, just enough to show the shapes moving closer before the footage cut out. I remember scrolling through all of it, feeling my gut twisting into knots. It didn't feel like internet hysteria, felt like something was wrong, real wrong, but people brushed it off, said it was some prank or viral stunt, something to get attention. But I know fear when I see it. And those people, they were terrified. And then the military got involved. That's when I knew something was really wrong. Seeing soldiers in Dallas didn't make sense. I remember listening to the radio and hearing them talk about a public safety operation. They were closing highways, locking down neighborhoods, but wouldn't say why. They told people to stay inside, keep their doors locked, and avoid travel. But Texans don't take kindly to being told to stay put. I saw footage of the soldiers in downtown Dallas. They were blocking off Main Street, all lined up with rifles and riot shields. And then you saw people running down the street covered in blood, screaming. And behind them, the biters. I'll never forget the way they moved. Not fast, not slow, just relentless. Like they didn't get tired. One soldier got tackled, and the thing bit through his helmet strap like it was beef jerky. That video played on loop for hours before it got pulled. But it didn't matter by then. The dam had already broken. People panicked, tried to run, tried to fight, tried to make sense of it. But how do you fight something that ain't alive? I called my brother that night. Told him to grab his wife and kids and get out of Dallas. He laughed at me. Said I was falling for internet nonsense. Said the news was just showing the same 5 seconds of footage over and over to scare people. I couldn't blame him for thinking that way. We were raised to believe the government lies to keep folks in line. But this wasn't a lie. I stayed up all night watching the news. By morning, the Dallas feed went dark. They never said what happened, just nothing. But when I tried calling my brother again, the line was dead. I should have gone looking for him. Should have done something. That was the last time I let myself believe things might get better. After the phones went dead and I couldn't reach my brother, things unraveled fast, like people were just waiting for an excuse to tear each other apart. Grocery stores got cleaned out in days. Not just the canned food, even the weird stuff nobody ever buys, like pickled pig's feet and sardine. I saw folks grabbing bags of flour like that was gonna help them survive. What the hell you gonna do with flour when you ain't got no power or running water? But I guess it made people feel like they were doing something. It got mean quick, real mean. People were fighting in the aisles, not arguing. I watched a woman bust another lady's face open with a can of green beans over a pack of bottled water. And nobody helped. People just stepped over her, grabbed what they could, and ran. The police tried to keep order at first, standing outside stores with rifles. But after a couple of days, they stopped showing up altogether. Guess they had their own families to look after. The worst part was the neighbors. People you'd wave to every morning. People you barbecued with. They turned into animals. I remember this guy from down the road, name was Joe, used to bring his kid over to fish in my pond. I saw him beating some old man half to death in the Dollar General parking lot over a pack of ramen noodles. Didn't even look like himself. Just wild-eyed and feral, like he'd already turned into one of them things without ever getting bit. The sheriff's department lasted longer than most, but that ain't saying much. At first, they tried to hold the line. Patrol cars circling neighborhoods, deputies knocking on doors, telling folks to stay inside. Temporary measures, they called it, said things would calm down once the military secured the cities. But the cities weren't getting secured. They were burning. I saw deputies break down right in the middle of the street. One guy, Deputy Harlan, he just sat on the curb outside the gas station, still in uniform, crying into his hands. His cruiser door was wide open, the lights still flashing. He'd given up, just quit. I stopped and asked him what happened, but he didn't even look at me. Just kept muttering, they wouldn't stay down. They wouldn't stay down. The last time I saw any law enforcement was when a deputy shot a man on Main Street in broad daylight. The guy had jumped a woman, tearing into her neck with his teeth. The deputy put 3 bullets in his back, but the man didn't drop. He turned around and charged. Took 5 more shots before he finally crumpled. The deputy backed away like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. And then he got in his car and drove off. He didn't even try to help the woman. The cops gave their all in the beginning. Sirens blaring every night. Deputies speeding down dirt roads with their lights flashing like it made a difference. They'd show up when someone called for help, bust down doors, drag folks out screaming and biting. But the calls kept coming. More every day. And it wasn't just the infected. People were turning on each other, fighting over food, water, stupid stuff like who had more ammo. And the deputies, they stopped coming. One day, the sheriff's station was just empty. Phones ringing off the hook, no one answering. I heard one of the dispatchers on the radio begging for backup. Said a mob had broken into the station, killed 2 officers for the last case of bottled water. By the next morning, the station was on fire. No one ever put it out. The static hums louder, filling the silence like a scream. The military didn't stick around either. We'd see helicopters flying over now and then, black shadows against the sunset. People would wave and shout, thinking someone might drop supplies or rescue them. But the helicopters never stopped. They just kept flying west, probably toward bigger cities, more important people. Guess a town like ours didn't make the cut. I kept wondering if the soldiers had orders to leave us behind, or if they just wanted to go home, Maybe they had families too. Maybe they looked down at us from those choppers and thought, why should I die for strangers? We were on our own now, just us and the biters. Of course, when I say us, I'm lying to myself. There wasn't no us anymore. No community, no neighbors looking out for each other. Society didn't just crumble, it rotted, like the infection spread to people's hearts, even if they weren't bit. And the folks you thought you knew, they weren't who you thought they were. I used to think people were mostly good. That deep down, folks wanted to help each other. That's what we were told, right? During hurricanes, tornadoes, people coming together, rebuilding. But this wasn't no natural disaster. Wasn't something you could fix with a food drive or some charity fund. This was the end. And when people realized there wasn't anyone coming to save them, something snapped. Turns out, a lot of folks were just monsters waiting for permission. And the end of the world just gave it to them. Ruby, she was part of the town. The kind of person who felt like a fixture, like she'd always been there and always would be. She ran the diner for damn near 30 years. Flipped burgers, poured coffee, and made sure nobody left hungry, even if they couldn't pay. I saw her cover meals for folks more times than I can count. Always said, "Don't worry, hun, you just get me next time." But I guess, other than the biters, human nature is still the world's biggest mystery. Carl told me what happened. Said old man Pete, who'd been eating at Ruby's since the place opened, tried to talk sense into her. Supplies were running out, people were starving. So he went to Ruby, told her they should pool what they had, ration together, try to keep the town going. Ruby smiled, nodded, told Pete to come back that night so they could work out a plan. So he did. But he didn't come back. Carl said he found Ruby out back, humming a song to herself. Her hands, they were a mess, and there was a crimson trail leading to the dumpster. Carl didn't stick around to look too close, didn't ask questions. Said the way she smiled at him made his stomach turn. I keep thinking about that damn spatula. How she used to smack folks with it if they got too rowdy in the diner. How she used to laugh while she did it. Now I wonder how long she kept laughing after everything fell apart. How many folks she led to the back alley, humming that same song every time. I guess you don't really know people, not until the world ends. And by then, it's too late to matter. Most folks fled, heard rumors about military bases out west, fortified camps, safe zones, places where you didn't have to sleep with a shotgun in your lap. So they packed up whatever they could carry and hit the road. Even Carl left. Carl didn't want to leave me behind. Said we could make it if we stuck together. I told him he and his girls could stay at the ranch so that we could build something real here, keep each other safe. But he wouldn't hear it. Said safe zones had fences, soldiers, and doctors. Said his girls deserved a real chance. I watched him load up the truck, hugged Carl, promised I'd see him again. Watched those taillights disappear down the road like they were blinking out of existence. Never saw him again. After Carl left, it was just me, my wife, and my land. The ranch had been in my family for generations. My granddaddy built the house with his own 2 hands. I couldn't leave it. Couldn't let it rot just 'cause the world outside went to hell. And where would I even go? I wasn't about to risk everything just based on some rumors. I got more of a fighting chance right here. And, of course, I have my wife. She's stronger than me, always has been. She's the kind of woman who wrangled cattle like it was nothing and patched up broken bones like she was born for it. I swear, she could survive out here longer than I could, but the thought of losing her, if something happened to her, that'd be it. I'd let the biters take me. Wouldn't be nothing left worth fighting for. So I stayed, fortified the place, barricaded the doors and windows, reinforced the walls with scrap metal and plywood, turned the barn into a food storehouse, kept the cattle, bred 'em slow, kept chickens for eggs, rigged up old solar panels I'd been too stubborn to throw out, gave myself enough juice to keep a radio running and power a single light bulb at night. And that's how I'm living my life every day, one day at a time, with the same old routine. I wake up before dawn, feed the animals, check the fences, scout the perimeter, fix whatever's broken, clear out any biters that wander too close. Then it's back to the house, eat what little we allow ourselves, ration the supplies. In the evenings, I sit by the radio, listening to static and faint voices crackling through the speakers, hoping to hear something good. A safe place, a cure, hell, even just someone telling a story. As night falls, we lock up tight, say a quiet prayer, hope the walls hold, hope tomorrow comes. It ain't much of a life, but it's a life. And for now, that's enough. I'm not saying this to sound condescending, but back then, a lot of people looked down on me, just 'cause I wanted to live the life of a farmer. Back in school, they'd tell me there was so much money out there in the world, big corporates, financial analysts, lawyers, you get the gist. They'd say I was wasting my potential, that I could do something bigger, better, that if I stayed working the land, I'd be throwing my life away. But I never saw it that way, not once. I always felt like this was what I was meant to do, working the land, raising cattle, feeling the dirt under my nails, breathing in the smell of the fields after a hard rain. There's a rhythm to it, a kind of quiet dignity in knowing the land provides because you put in the work. When you live like that, you start to understand the world in a way most folks don't. You learn patience, learn to respect things you can't control, and you learn how to make do with what you got, 'cause out there ain't no one coming to save you if you screw up. And when things turned to hell, it didn't matter how much of a corporate big shot someone was. Didn't matter how many degrees they had hanging on their wall or how many zeros were in their bank account. Money was worthless now. Power meant nothing. People who'd spent their whole lives climbing ladders and pushing papers, they didn't know what to do when the grocery stores emptied out and the gas stations ran dry. All the things they thought would keep them safe turned to dust. And suddenly, the ones they used to look down on, the ranchers, the farmers, the mechanics, the folks who knew how to build and fix and grow, we were the ones still standing. I don't say this to kick folks while they're down. I really don't. But the truth is, people got comfortable, soft. And I get it, the world we built made it easy to forget how fragile everything was. But when the walls came crashing down, the only thing that mattered was what you could hold on to when everything else was gone. And most folks didn't have nothing to hold on to. No skills, no community, no idea how to fend for themselves. They were just lost. But the worst part is even the ones who did know how to survive. They forgot what made life worth surviving for. They turned on each other, started hoarding supplies, fighting over scraps, hurting people just to get a little further down the road. It didn't take long for the world to go feral. And maybe that's the part that sticks with me the most. People show their real selves when the lights go out. And what I saw, I can't forget it. Probably never will. I guess folks like me were lucky. Our whole lives were a lesson in survival. But luck don't mean much if you forget the reasons you're fighting to stay alive. And I think that's what keeps me going. My wife, my land. The hope that maybe, just maybe, there's something left worth saving out there. I remember the first time I saw a biter. Before that, I'd only seen them on the screen grainy cell phone footage, shaky news clips, the kind of stuff that made it easy to tell myself it wasn't real, or at least not that real. They were frightening, sure, but there's a safety to watching horror unfold through a screen, like it puts distance between you and the nightmare. Up close, though, there's no comparison. The first time I saw a biter up close, I damn near shot myself in the foot. I was out by the north fence, checking on the cattle. They'd been spooked the night before, all clustered in the corner of the pasture, bawling and restless. Figured maybe a coyote got brave, so I took the shotgun just in case. It was early sun barely peeking over the horizon, painting everything that sickly orange color. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, just the faint creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. And then I saw it. It wasn't wandering like you'd expect. It was crouched by one of the steers, hands buried in its belly, pulling out ropes of meat like it was bobbing for apples. The cow's ribs were spread wide, guts spilling onto the dirt in steaming heaps. The biter didn't even look up, just kept digging, smearing gore across its face. When it finally turned its head, my stomach dropped. Its skin was gray, stretched tight like old leather, with patches sloughing off in wet clumps. The eyes were the worst, cloudy and bulbous, almost popping out of the skull. Mouth crusted and black, lips peeled back so far it looked like a permanent snarl. But it wasn't just the rot that got to me. It was the way it looked at me, like it recognized me. I raised the shotgun, but my hands were shaking. I told myself to shoot, but I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, while it slowly stood up. Bones cracking like dried twigs. Its jaw hung loose, swaying as it stumbled toward me, bare feet squelching in the mud and blood. I don't know how long I stood there, heart hammering so loud I thought my chest would burst. But then the biter let out this noise, this wet, rattling moan. Like air hissing through waterlogged lungs, something snapped in my head, and I fired. The blast shredded its shoulder, but it didn't stop. It just kept coming, arms outstretched, fingers twitching like it couldn't wait to grab hold of me. I fired again and again until I was clicking on an empty chamber and the thing was finally still. It lay there in the dirt, jaw working like it was trying to chew the air. Even as the light faded from its eyes, it didn't stop biting. I went home, locked every door, and sat on the couch for 6 hours, just staring at my hands. That was the day I realized there ain't no mercy left in the world, not from the biters, and not from whatever God let this happen. I heard the screams last night. I thought I was imagining it. At first the wind was howling, rain hammering against the roof in sheets. But then, cutting through the storm, I heard it. A low, broken wail. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening so hard my ears hurt. My wife was still asleep and I didn't want to wake her. The sound swelled, building into something worse, a raw, throat-tearing shriek, the kind of noise that made my skin crawl. It echoed through the fields, twisted and distorted by the rain. I got up and pressed my face to the window, but all I could see was darkness and the way the rain blurred the glass. The screaming didn't stop. It rose and it didn't sound human. Or maybe that was the worst part. It did sound human, just not like a human in their right mind. It sounded like someone losing themselves, like someone being torn apart piece by piece. I wanted to ignore it, wanted to crawl back into bed and pretend I'd misheard, but I couldn't. Not with the way it went on, changing pitch, stretching out into these awful, broken gasps. I grabbed my rifle, slid on my boots, and stepped onto the porch. The rain hit me like ice, so cold it made my teeth ache. It poured down in heavy sheets so thick I could barely see past the fence. The screaming had quieted to a wet, choked sobbing, but it was closer now. Too close. I scanned the horizon, knuckles white on the rifle, but the fields were just shadows. The rain made everything worse, making the grass sway like something was moving through it. But I swear I could feel something out there, a heaviness hanging in the air, watching me. I waited an hour, standing on the porch, rain soaking me to the bone. The screaming didn't come back, but I didn't sleep. This morning, I found bloody handprints on the back gate. Fresh, rain-smeared, like someone had been banging on the wood with broken fingers. The prints trailed off into the field, disappearing into the tall, drenched grass. I thought about following them, but I didn't. I ain't stupid. I reinforced the gate, checked the cattle, and tried to push it out of my head. But when the rain stopped and the wind settled, I swear I could still hear it. Distant screaming. Getting closer. I swear the rain makes them worse. Maybe it washes the scent of death through the fields, draws them in like vultures. Or maybe it just makes them quieter, the sound of their rotten flesh dragging through the mud, masked by the storm. Either way, they always come when it rains. I was just about to call it a night when I heard her voice, sharp, urgent, cutting through the storm like a knife. "Jay, get out here!" My heart dropped. I grabbed my rifle and bolted for the door without even thinking. She was standing by the chicken coop, barefoot in the mud, soaking wet, but holding an axe like she was ready for war. The hens were screaming inside the coop, feathers bursting through the cracks in the wood. "There's something in there," she said, her voice tight. It got in somehow. I could barely hear her over the rain pounding against the tin roof, but the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. I nodded, cocked the rifle, and crept toward the coop. The smell hit me first, like meat left out in the sun too long, thick, putrid, sticky. I gagged but pressed on, pushing open the door with the barrel of my gun. And there it was. It was lying on the dirt floor, half buried in straw and mud, dragging itself toward the chickens with slow, jerky movements. No arms, no legs, just a bloated, festering torso, ribs poking through torn flesh like jagged knives. The thing's spine stuck out of its back, broken in several places, but somehow it kept moving, arching, twisting like a maggot. Its head flopped to the side, neck half snapped, eyes glazed over but still locked on the terrified chickens. The mouth was wrong. No jaw, just a gaping black hole. The throat muscles convulsing and stretching like it was still trying to bite, to tear, to feed. I couldn't move. I'd seen biters before, but not like this. This one was old, decayed past the point of reason, nothing but sinew and rot, but still alive. It had slithered in through a gap at the bottom of the fence, probably lost its limbs to the barbed wire, and just kept crawling until it found shelter, until it found food. The thing let out a wet, rasping sound, a gurgle that almost sounded like words, and lunged forward, slamming its face into the dirt. It started dragging itself faster, leaving a slimy trail of blood and muck behind it, the exposed bone of its spine scraping against the wood floor. I raised my rifle, hands shaking, but my wife didn't wait. She stepped past me, swung the axe down with both hands, and split the thing's skull like a melon. It spasmed, body twitching and writhing for a few more seconds before finally going still. She yanked the axe free, wiped the gore off on her jeans, and turned to me, breathing hard. "We need to check the fence," she said, her voice like steel. I followed her out into the storm without a word, rifle still gripped tight in my hands. We walked the property line, searching every inch of the fence until we found the gap, a section near the back pasture where the rain had softened the dirt enough for one of the fence posts to collapse inward. She held the flashlight while I hammered a plank over the hole, both of us drenched, covered in mud and bits of brain matter, but working like our lives depended on it. Because they did. When we finally got back to the house, she stripped off her soaked clothes, showered, and went straight to bed. No crying, no breaking down, just exhaustion. I stayed up, sat by the front door with my rifle across my lap, listening to the storm die down, watching the fields for movement. I don't know how she stays so strong. I don't know how she keeps going when it feels like we're losing a little more ground every day. But I do know this: I'd be dead without her. I have some good news to share for once. That feels almost unnatural to say, like I'm tempting fate. In a world where just making it through the day is a miracle, good news feels like something out of an old storybook. But sometimes miracles do happen. I woke up before dawn, same as always, made some coffee, checked the perimeter, fed the animals. The routine kept me grounded. Breakfast was quiet. My wife and I talked a little, mostly about the small things. The east fence was holding up, but the gate by the tool shed was sticking again. I promised I'd take care of it later, though neither of us really cared much about the gate. It was just easier to talk about broken things we could fix. In the afternoon, I was out by the south fence, patching up a section where a branch had snapped the wire loose. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made you forget, even just for a moment, what the world had turned into. Then I saw someone out in the field. At first, my chest locked up. I thought it was a biter, the way he staggered, slow and uneven. But something felt off. He didn't move like them, not quite. I climbed up the watchtower, grabbed the rifle, and looked through the scope. It was Carl. I nearly dropped the gun. My throat tightened so fast I couldn't even call out at first. He looked terrible, face pale, streaked with dirt, clothes torn and hanging off him like rags. But it was him. I ran out to meet him, my heart hammering so loud it drowned out everything else. I kept shouting his name, hoping he'd answer, but he didn't. By the time I reached him, he collapsed into my arms. He was skin and bones, and I couldn't tell if he was even fully aware I was there. Relief hit me like a wave he was alive, but panic followed just as fast. He was alive, yes, but barely. I carried him back to the house, my arms shaking, not from the weight, but from fear. My wife helped me clean him up, and we got him some food and water. He sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, staring at the flames without saying a word. I wanted to talk, to say something that might make him feel safe, but I couldn't find the words. I just sat there, watching him, trying to piece together how he had ended up like this. When he finally spoke, he said he'd been at a refuge with his daughters. A safe place, he said, with walls and good people. He told me he left the girls with friends and came to check on me. I couldn't understand why he'd risk the trip if he was safe, if his girls were safe. Carl just shook his head and muttered that he kept thinking about me out here, alone, and that it didn't sit right with him. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or angry. Part of me wanted to call him a fool for making such a dangerous trip, but another part of me was just glad to see his face again. I asked him about the journey, hoping talking about it might help him process it. He nodded and said the roads were crawling with biters, that he thought he was going to die at least a dozen times, but he couldn't turn back. Then he told me I could come back with him to the refuge, that I didn't have to stay out here anymore. I told him the same thing I told him the day he left. This was my home. I couldn't leave it. Carl just nodded. I told him he needed to rest, that he wasn't in any shape to travel yet. He looked frustrated, like he hated the idea of staying still, but he didn't fight me on it. And now, as I sit here talking to all of you, he's resting in the guest room. I'm so relieved he's back, but he's not the same Carl I remember. I just hope some rest, some time, might bring him back to himself. Today, Carl barely ate. I set a bowl of stew in front of him, hoping a good meal might lift his spirits, but he just sat there, staring at it like he didn't know what to do with it. Eventually, he took a few bites, then pushed the bowl away. He jumped at every sound, the wind rattling the windows, the creak of the floorboards. I kept telling him it was just the house settling, but he couldn't relax. He flinched like he was expecting something to come crashing through the door at any moment. I tried to get him to talk about the refuge or his girls, hoping it might give him some comfort, but he barely said anything. He just muttered that they were fine and then went quiet again. It hurt to see him like this. Carl had always been the strongest of us, the guy who kept everyone together when things got bad. Seeing him so distant, so shaken, made me feel helpless. Later, while we sat on the porch, I suggested he talk to all of you. I thought maybe sharing news about a safe place might give him some purpose. He just muttered that he'd do it another night. I didn't push. I figured he just needed time. I hoped that was all he needed. In the evening, we did a perimeter check. Carl spotted a section of fence that was loose, barbed wire sagging like something had tried to pull it apart. I said it was probably the wind or an animal. Carl just shook his head and grabbed the tools to fix it without a word. I told him he should rest, that I could handle it. He snorted and said he was still better at this stuff than me. He wasn't wrong. We worked in silence, and the whole time I kept sneaking glances at him, hoping to catch even a flicker of the Carl I used to know. But he didn't joke, didn't complain, didn't say anything at all unless he had to. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Carl wiped his hands, muttered that the fence was better, and went back inside without waiting for me. I stayed out there a little longer, looking at the woods and listening to the quiet. I told myself it was just another day, just another broken fence. But it wasn't. Carl was here, alive, but it felt like something had followed him back from wherever he'd been, and I couldn't help wondering if he was ever really going to come back all the way. He's sleeping in the guest room now, probably out like a light. After everything, his body finally gave in. Maybe tomorrow he'd feel better. I hope he feels better. The morning felt surprisingly peaceful, like the world outside hadn't fallen apart. Carl and I woke up early, the sky blushing pink and gold. The air smelled crisp, frost crunching under our boots as we made our way to the barn. We went through the motions, feeding the animals, checking fences, tending the garden. The work was quiet, but comforting in its rhythm. I talked while we worked, filling the silence with old memories and small observations. The goats were getting fat, the chickens laid more eggs than usual, and the apple tree by the well was starting to bud again. Carl listened, nodding every so often. At first, I didn't think he was paying attention, but then he pointed out a broken latch on the chicken coop I hadn't noticed. He fixed it without a word, his hands moving with the steady competence he'd always had. Later, while we patched a section of fence, I brought up the time he got chased halfway across the field by that mean old rooster we used to have. Carl actually laughed a small rusty sound, but a laugh nonetheless. It caught me so off guard I nearly dropped the hammer. I laughed too, maybe a little too hard, like if I laughed loud enough I could pull more of that sound out of him. For a few minutes, we leaned against the fence, catching our breath. Carl wiped his eyes, muttering that he'd forgotten all about that stupid bird, and for a little while, he almost seemed like himself again. When we headed back to the house for lunch, my wife made soup, and we sat around the table like a normal family. Carl ate more than he had the day before and even made a quiet comment about how good the bread was. My wife smiled so wide, I thought she might cry. The day stretched on, and the sun felt warmer than usual. We fixed the sagging roof on the tool shed, cleaned out the rain gutters, and gathered firewood for the night. It felt good, working together like that, like we were building something, not just surviving. For the first time since Carl showed up, I started to hope. Maybe he just needed a few more days of rest, a few more days of normal. Maybe the weight he was carrying would start to lift. For a little while, it almost felt like the world was giving us a break. Carl started slipping away again in the afternoon. We sat on the porch, resting after the day's work. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fields, and everything glowed with that soft, golden light that made the world look almost gentle. But Carl just stared out at the horizon, eyes distant and unfocused, like he was looking for something. or like he was remembering something he didn't want to. I asked what he was thinking about. He blinked, like he'd forgotten I was even there, and muttered that it was nothing. Said he was just tired. But the way he said it, like the words were dragging him down, made my chest ache. Later, while I helped my wife knead dough for bread, Carl watched us from the doorway. My wife laughed at something I said, flour dust in her hands, and she wiped it on my cheek just to mess with me. It was a small, silly moment, but it made us both smile. When I glanced over at Carl, his hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists and muttered that he needed some air. Walked outside without waiting for a response. I wanted to follow him, but my wife stopped me. She said he might just need a moment, and maybe she was right. But something about the way he looked as he stepped off the porch stuck with me like he was holding something in so tight it was eating him alive. I let him go, hoping the quiet of the evening would settle whatever storm was churning inside him. It's past midnight now. I wanted to check in with you all before trying to get some rest. Carl's still out there. After my wife went to bed, he said he needed some air. I didn't think much of it at first. He's been restless since he showed up, so I figured maybe the quiet was getting to him. But then I saw the glow, faint, flickering orange through the window. I stepped onto the porch, and my stomach twisted. Carl had built a fire out by the edge of the property. Not in the pit we usually use, but past the fence line, out in the open. The flames were big, too big, crackling like he'd fed the whole forest into it. I called out to him. He didn't answer. I grabbed a lantern and walked out there, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I got close, I found him sitting by the fire, knees drawn up to his chest, arms wrapped tightly around himself. His face was pale and stretched thin, eyes reflecting the firelight like glass. I asked him what he was doing, why he built the fire out there. He didn't look at me, just kept staring into the flames, his lips moving like he was whispering to someone. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it sounded constant like a prayer, or a plea. Eventually, I came back to the house figuring he just needed space to burn off whatever was weighing him down. But when I glanced back from the porch, he was still there, still staring into the fire, still whispering. The fire's still burning now. I can see the glow through the window, even from here. I keep telling myself he just needs time, that maybe tomorrow will be better. I hope it will. I really hope it will. This is my last broadcast. I'm in the attic now, barricaded the door with whatever I could find. The signal's still holding, so I'm using what little time I have left to talk to you all one last time. The ranch is gone. The biters are everywhere, clawing at the walls, dragging themselves over the wreckage of the fence. I can hear them downstairs, shuffling through the house, scratching at the floorboards like they can already smell me up here. I know me and wife are goners. But before this ends, I'll tell you how this happened. How in just a few hours our lives fell apart. I woke up to chaos. Engines roaring, cattle screaming, rain hammering the roof like gunfire. For a second, I was disoriented. thinking maybe it was just a storm rattling the ranch. But then the house trembled, not from thunder, but from something crashing through the fence. I sat up so fast my head spun. The wet, ugly sound of tires ripping through mud filled the air, headlights slicing through the dark, rain-drenched dawn. I rushed to the window, my breath fogging up the glass, and swiped my sleeve across it to see outside. My heart slammed against my ribs. The fence was down. 3 massive trucks plowed through the broken section, tearing up the field as they barreled onto the property. Cows scattered, their hooves churning up mud, slipping, colliding with each other in panic. They bellowed and thrashed, eyes wild with terror. One slammed into the side of the barn with a sickening crack, its body collapsing into a heap, legs twitching. The trucks skidded to a stop, and men spilled out of them like snakes from a nest, armed to the teeth, rifles slung across their backs, machetes glinting in the dim morning light. My wife stirred beside me, her voice groggy and laced with confusion as she asked what was going on. I couldn't even speak. My mouth was dry, my hands already shaking as I grabbed a rifle from beside the bed. I yanked on my boots, heart hammering so loud I could barely think. Rain pounded against the windows, the sky a dull gray smudge of dawn, and the men outside fanned out across the property with purpose, boots splashing through puddles, weapons raised. And then I saw Carl. He stood by the barn, soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to him like a second skin. Rain streaked down his face, plastering his hair to his forehead, but he didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, watching the men pour onto the ranch like he had been expecting them, like he knew they were coming. The rain kept falling, soaking everything, the mud, the blood, the broken fence. The gang moved fast, like they had done this 100 times. They rounded up the cattle, dragging the terrified animals through the mud, shoving supplies into crates, ransacking everything we had built. I crouched behind the woodpile, my chest heaving, rifle gripped so tight my fingers ached. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Carl stood there, drenched and motionless, like a man who had already died inside. Then the leader of the gang stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard streaked with gray. A cigarette dangled from his lips, the ember barely glowing against the rain. He clapped Carl on the shoulder like they were old friends, and Carl shuddered. The man sneered and told Carl that he had done well and that his girls would be safe once they were done here. Carl crumpled. His knees hit the mud with a wet slap, and he started shaking. Full-body tremors like his bones were vibrating under his skin. The gang leader just laughed and walked away, barking orders to his men while Carl fell apart. I moved closer, heart pounding, my clothes soaked through, mud dragging at my boots. Carl didn't even notice me until I was standing right there, my rifle trembling in my hands. I whispered his name, and he flinched like I had struck him. Then he broke. He told me everything. The refuge had been real, at first, a safe haven with walls, food, people working together to survive. For a while, Carl thought they had found a future, something stable, something better, but safety hadn't lasted long in that world. The gang had come like a plague. They had overrun the refuge in a single night, killing anyone who resisted, stringing bodies along the walls as a warning. They had turned the place into their personal kingdom, ruling over the survivors like tyrants. The food stores had dwindled fast, too many mouths, not enough to go around. The gang had taken the best for themselves, letting everyone else starve. Carl had tried to escape. He had waited until dark, carrying his daughters through a storm, and sneaking past the guards with nothing but a knife and a prayer. He had almost made it. Almost. But they had caught him 2 miles out, dragged him back to the refuge, beaten him until he couldn't stand, and kept beating him until he had spilled everything. Where he had been going. Who he had been looking for. What had waited at the ranch. Carl's voice shook as he told me. He gripped my sleeve like he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. He told me how they had tortured him, how they had promised to hurt his girls if he didn't talk. And when he had finally given them what they wanted, the gang leaders had started planning. They had let Carl live. Let him walk free so he could lead them straight to me. The ranch was a gold mine. It had food stocks, equipment, cattle, goats, enough to keep a group alive for months. Carl had been their ticket in. He had been the perfect pawn. He had known the layout of the property, every weak spot, every blind corner. He had known our routines when we slept, when we did patrols, how often we checked the fences. And more than anything, he had known me. He had known I'd never turn him away. The gang hadn't needed to storm the place blindly. They hadn't had to waste time testing our defenses. They had Carl for that. He had loosened the barricades bit by bit, just enough so the wood would splinter easier under pressure. He had bent and clipped sections of barbed wire, making them sag and rust, weak enough to rip apart with a few good tugs. He had let the gates stick and weaken, so they'd snap open when pushed just right. And the fire the night before, that had been the final nail in the coffin. Carl had waited until he'd done enough damage to make a breach simple, then lit the fire as a beacon, a signal, a glowing torch telling the gang the walls were ready to fall. But it hadn't just been the ranch he had broken down. It had been me. He had laughed with me, eaten with me, told me stories about his girls by the fire. He had made me feel like, for the first time in years, I wasn't completely alone. He had made me lower my guard, made me trust him. So when the trucks had come and the gates had fallen, it hadn't just been the walls that had collapsed. It had been everything. He had sobbed, face twisted with grief and guilt, repeating how sorry he was like the words might undo the damage. I didn't know what else to do. He had choked out. They would have killed my girls. I had barely been able to hear him over the pounding rain, over the thunder rumbling through the sky, over the sound of the gang laughing while they loaded up the trucks with everything we had built. And all I had been able to think was that the biters hadn't been the monsters. It had only been a matter of time before the gang had gotten what they came for and decided we weren't worth the trouble. They had rounded up the cattle, loaded the supplies into their trucks, laughing like they had owned the world. The leader had kept eyeing me and my wife like we were just loose ends to tie up. People like them didn't leave survivors. They didn't take chances. I had known it. Carl had known it. I had seen it in his face, the way he had crumpled to the ground, sobbing, begging them to let us go, but they hadn't even looked at him. He wasn't useful anymore. I had already been bracing myself for what came next. Figured I'd die fast if I were lucky. But then, something had happened. something none of us had seen coming. The engines. The roaring, growling engines that had smashed through our gates hadn't just woken us up. They had woken everything else up, too. At first, it had been a few biters stumbling out of the woods, dragging themselves through the rain like shadows. Then a dozen more. Then 50. And then they had poured through the tree line like a wave, hundreds of them all swarming toward the noise, the shouting, the smell of blood in the air. The gang had tried to fight. They had fired round after round into the horde, but it hadn't mattered. They had gone down screaming, torn apart by the same monsters they had been using to control people for years. The gang had scattered like rats, running in every direction as the horde engulfed the ranch. They had screamed, shouted, and fired wildly into the swarm, but it had been useless. The biters hadn't stopped. They never stopped. I'd seen one of the gang leaders try to climb onto a truck, slipping on the slick metal as a biter had grabbed his leg and yanked him down. He had disappeared beneath a mass of rotting bodies, his screams cut short. Another man had sprinted toward the broken fence line, slipped in the mud, and the dead had been on him in seconds, tearing into him like wild animals. And Carl hadn't moved. He had just stood there, soaked in rain, knees digging into the mud where he had collapsed after confessing everything. His chest had heaved like he was trying to catch his breath, but he had never lifted his head. He hadn't run. He hadn't even tried. The biters had closed in, groaning and snarling, and Carl had just let them. They had grabbed him, clawed at his clothes, their teeth sinking into his skin, and he hadn't fought back. Hadn't screamed. He had just stood there as they had torn him apart, like he had thought he deserved it, like it had been the only way he could atone for what he had done. I had wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I should have hated him. I should have felt relief that he was gone after what he had done. But all I had felt was sick, because Carl hadn't been a monster. He had just been a man who had made a choice. A horrible, desperate choice to save his daughters, and it had destroyed him. By the time the biters had finished with him, there had been nothing left but torn fabric and blood in the mud. The property had turned into a slaughterhouse. I had grabbed my wife, dragged her toward the house while the swarm had flooded the fields. The gang had barely even noticed us running. They had been too busy trying not to get devoured. We had made it to the attic, slammed the door, barricaded it, and watched through the cracks as the ranch fell apart. And now the biters are everywhere, clawing at the walls, scraping at the doors. They're not leaving. They're not getting tired. And I don't think we're getting out of this one. My wife and I are in the attic now, the doors barricaded with whatever we could grab, an old dresser, some boxes, anything to buy us a little more time. But it won't hold forever. The biters are relentless, clawing at the walls, pounding on the doors downstairs like they can smell the blood that's already been spilled. The rain taps against the roof, steady and cold, almost drowning out the relentless scraping below. I don't know how much longer we have. I don't know if anyone's even listening. But I turn on the radio anyway, because if this is the end, someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember.